Hello, historians. Today we are going to discuss the New Era, which is the term your text uses to describe the 1920s. So today we're going to focus specifically on the decade of the 1920s. We'll look at the rise of consumerism and mass consumption, and we'll mention prohibition, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. You will be taking notes because this lecture can help you for this week's challenge. So I encourage you to open up your Word document, your notebook, grab a piece of paper, whatever note-taking process you use, and we'll get started. As always, I am your host, Dr. Summer Sherland. To get started, I'm going to have you right away pause the video and search the concept of the Roaring Twenties. So conduct an internet search. You can just go on Google if that's what you'd like, and search the terms Roaring Twenties. And in a very short period of time, write down at least 10 terms or phrases that strike you as relevant about the 1920s. Just make a list of 10 relevant terms about the 1920s. Pause the recording and come back when you're ready. Okay, what did you come up with? You probably found things like flappers, jazz, new, right? Something new about the new era, new Negro, new woman, right? You might have come up with mass consumption or a surging economy, alcohol, right? Prohibition, gang, organized gang, activity or mob activity. Maybe you came up with like the automobile or inventions, right? So there's all kinds of things that may have come up for you when you conducted your internet search. And I would wager a guess that any one of those terms that you have on your list there is going to be relevant in today's lesson. So here's how the 1920s begins. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding, now both the text that you're reading this week and the film that you're expected to review, and lots of texts, right, and lots of films begin with Warren G. Harding's presidential address. And I'm not totally sure, but I think it's because it contradicts what Warren G. Harding says in 1921 completely actually contradicts what happens over the course of the next 9 years. Here's what he says. He says, basically, America's going to return to normalcy. We're going to get back to normal. We're going to get back to what you remember about America and the American project. And here's the context, right? What is he talking about? A return to normalcy. What's normal and what's the return from? The nation, according to the American Yap, still reeled from the shock of World War I. This is the first kind of all-involved war that included lots of, most of Europe, parts of Asia, parts of Northern Africa, and America, right? So you've got this huge war that took up a lot of everyone's attention, and it was overseas, but it included most colonial countries. So the American Yap says the nation still reeled from the shock of World War I, the explosion of racial violence and the political repressions in America in 1918, and a lingering fear of communism called the Red Scare. And that comes back, right? This comes back in just a couple of decades. But basically, America, what Harding is saying is that we turned outward at one point. We looked elsewhere. We became colonialist. We became imperialist. We annexed new lands, right? We entered World War I. We tried to broker worldwide peace through the League of Nations. And Harding is saying, no more. We're actually going to turn back inward. We're going to return to Washington's belief that we should be focused on ourselves, isolationists, separate, right? But the reality is the 1920s become anything but normal in America. Everything changes, and the decade reshapes American life dramatically from social, economic, and political perspectives. So here's some federal politics, some things that give you like the general backdrop of what's happening in the country across the board politically. World War I propaganda and that fear of communism, this is something that we think about happening a lot after World War II, but it actually is really woven into the fabric after World War I, creates a suspicion of really anybody who could be seen as less than American. Anybody who isn't sort of checking all these boxes as American, they are threatening, they are dangerous, they are outsiders, they need to be controlled, right? Harding, who is this guy who says we're going to return to normalcy and all of that, he actually ends up leading one of the most corrupt presidencies in American history. You can Google that term, Teapot Dome scandal. And then in 1923, he collapses unexpectedly. He dies. And Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, becomes the president of the United States. Coolidge is, they refer to him as Silent Cal. He's like kind of a sort of a not a shining star, right? He's a little dowdy. He's a little quiet. He's a little like businessy. He's not gregarious, outgoing, interesting, charismatic politician. So he worked really hard, though, to erase the scandalous stain left behind by Harding. And his slogan becomes, "The chief business of American people is business." His priorities, Silent Cal's priorities, are corporate, business, financial interests, right? He is really focused on supporting the wealthy, right, which is mostly white American men, landowning, corporate owning men, and business interests. He's very focused on the economy. So he ends up not running for re-election. And oftentimes there's this little story told about how he chose not to run or announced he wasn't running. Like a lot of times you might know, depending on if this is an election year or not, like there's a lot of buildup about whether the president will run for re-election. And Silent Cal just goes into a press conference and he just is like, I choose not to run for a second term. Like, and some stories exist that he like handed his press secretary a note that just said, I choose not to run. Like he wasn't about being in the public eye at all. And that really influences kind of the way people view the presidency until Franklin Roosevelt comes along. So in 1928, Herbert Hoover runs. And Herbert Hoover focuses on prosperity, right? He focuses on the country reclaiming and really joining into this like exciting new economy that Cal gets a lot of credit for. And when he gives his inauguration speech in 1928-29, Hoover promises America that poverty worldwide, but mostly in this nation, will be banished, right? Poverty in America will not exist under his presidency. Well, it's 1928. Do you know what happens in October of 1929? The Great Depression. So from 1920 to 1929, here's what happens. Here's how we have this huge boom in economics and business interests, and then the promise that America is so financially secure that there will never be poverty ever again. And then, of course, the collapse at the end of the decade. So here's how it happens. One of the things that's really key to understanding the 1920s is the rise of activism, right? You have the rise of women's groups, typically white middle-class women, but there were lots of African-American organizations as well that focused on women's issues. But women in the 1920s who are white and wealthy, they get a lot of credit. And in part because these are the organizations of women who really, really got out there in the public and tried to activate for the women's vote, right, for suffrage. So during the 1920s, you have organizations of women's parties who are sort of like activists for women's suffrage or women's enfranchisement. You also have founded in the 1910s or like before 1910 was the NAACP, but they continue to be really, really relevant in the 1920s. And that's because they're focusing on violence and abuse against African Americans across the country. The other thing that's happening in the 1920s, and this has to do with those economic developments, right, is a culture of consumption. And I just want you to think, right, like, let's just pick a spot in the middle of the country and pretend that we're living there in the 19-teens, right? Let's say that we're living on a farm, like a homestead in Iowa in the 19-teens, right? Your corporation is your home, right? Your home is your entire domain. And everything that happens in your home, you're responsible for in one way or another. And that's still true today, but I'm talking in terms of the creation of goods. So let's say the floors that you lay, right? The floors that get laid on your floor, or the milk that you need for food, for dinner, right? The milk you need for whatever casserole you're making, or your clothes, your hats, your gloves. Every single thing until the 1920s, for the most part, was handmade and sort of custom created for the American person, the person living there, right? So like look down at your clothes right now. Which thing on you anywhere have you made yourself? Did you create yourself? A lot of us have our own style, right? A lot of us have our own fashion. We might have embellishments here and there that we've added to things, but it's really, really unlikely that any of us are wearing the same amount of homemade clothes, right? That people in the 19 teens were wearing. It really was, prior to the 1920s, it really was a culture of custom made single items by one person, right? So the mother, for example, was responsible for teaching her daughters how to sew and creating and outfitting the entire family. Now, of course, she went to town, right? Or she ordered fabric. But by the 19 teens, there's a rise of like catalog consumption. So Sears begins sending out catalogs, Montgomery Ward, across the country for people to look through and say like, oh, I could buy this dress instead of buying the fabric and making it myself. So you have a shift in American culture and American consumption, American economy, where people shift from homemade to ready to wear, ready to eat, ready to drive. And one of the most popular and kind of famous examples is the concept of the automobile. So in the 1920s, you have the first production of the assembly line, because prior to the 1920s was World War I, right? These factories, these plants were being used to put out lots of wartime materials, guns, ammunition, etc., right? Well, then the war ends and these huge factories are ready to use for something else. And the automobile industry puts that to great use. They begin churning out cars. Rather than having to custom build a car for each individual person, they actually begin putting together the pieces, all the same pieces, and putting them together one at a time, and just cars start coming out on the line. So now a person can purchase a car. They don't have to have a car designed. They don't have to have a carriage created. They don't have to barter for one or create their own. They can purchase a ready-made car. It's the first time in American culture that this becomes mainstream, right? So here's another aspect of the 1920s that is defined by wealth. There's a culture of escape. Now think about this. There's two things that become common in the 1920s, gasoline and electricity. What does gasoline represent to the American person, or American young people especially? What does electricity represent to American young people? So here's my favorite example. Let's pretend we're living in that house in Iowa. It's the 19 teens, right? And you want to date somebody in your community. You want to date somebody, right? How are you going to date them? What are you going to do? How do you want to establish a relationship with this person in your community? You probably met them at school or church, or you knew them growing up. You date their whole family in the 19 teens and then before that. You go to their house, you sit in their parlor, you visit, it's called calling, you come calling, you sit in their home and date their parents, date their family, date them, right? Because it's all of you together in one place at a time. But as people begin to have access more and more to cars, they begin to have more and more privacy with individuals. So now in the 1920s, if you're well enough to do family and you're a teenager or a young person, you're able to get in your car, drive to that house across town, pick that person up that you want to go on a date with, and go, right? You leave the house, you're free. You go anywhere else. You could go to the movies, you could go to a little arcade, you could go to a carnival, you could go to church, you could go to school, you could just drive, right? A complete new approach to socializing happens because of gasoline, because of the creation of cars. And the same is true for electricity. You know, there of course were street lamps that were lit. There were, you know, oil lamps that were lit every night in major cities, but electricity changes the way people are able to function in terms of time. Before electricity, you would wake up with the sun, you would go to bed around the same time that the sun went to bed. Well, electricity changes the game. Now people can kind of stay awake a little longer. They can go to nightclubs, they can go to movies, right? There's a whole new form of living, of being, of having fun, if you have access to means, of course. One of the pictures I put on this slide is of these, you know, women in the 1920s wearing their little flapper outfits, visiting Egypt, just like on the edge of the world, right? They had the opportunity to go places. The 1920s is the first time that America, for example, begins to really see a ramp up of tourism. That's how people get to the Grand Canyon now. They're able to go see the Grand Canyon because they have access to the means to get them there in the first place. So let's talk about the flapper, the new woman, right? This is a symbol. This is a representation. I wouldn't say all women in the 1920s embodied or embraced the flapper look or the flapper spirit, but she came to really represent particularly white urban women who had means, who were either wealthy or aspirational, or middle class, upper middle class. The flapper embodied spending. Look at her dress, right? Look at her clothes. Like all of these things that she purchased, she did not make herself. She embodied materialism, appearance, pleasure, and gender nonconformity. So the reason that the flapper is so iconic is like, look at her dress. You can see how smooth and free her dress is. There's no waistband. There's no corset. There's no hoop skirt. Her shortened waistline, or her shortened hemline shows you that she's not encumbered by that hula hoop that used to be around women's ankles that made or around their, kind of their rumps that made their silhouette go like this to this to this, right? 19 teens and before that, women's silhouettes were shoulders, waist, feet, right? Shoulders were broad, waist was tiny, feet were broad. And that's because that was done with either corsets or these massive wicker or wooden hoops that were built into their dresses. So they swished while they walked. Imagine driving a car with a hula hoop around your feet. You wouldn't be able to do it, right? So the flapper has to get a whole new look. A woman has to get an entirely new wardrobe in order to even drive a car, right? In order to engage and enjoy that freedom that becomes so crucial in the 1920s. The Chicago Tribune said, today's woman gets what she wants. The vote, slim sheaths of silk to replace voluminous petticoats, glassware in sapphire blue or glowing amber. If you ever go to a thrift store, look for what's called Depression era glass. It's glass that's a different color, blue, amber, pink, right? Green. The right to a career, soap to match her bathroom color scheme. All of those things are purchased. All of those things are consumption, right? So the woman's kind of identity as a new woman, as a flapper, was tied to consumption, the things she could purchase, the things she could buy. But something that's really crucial to understand is that the flapper was representational. She was an icon. She was an image. The actual real changes in society tended to be subtler. They were a little bit more subtle and specific to white aspirational classes. That's not to say there weren't African-American flappers or Latina flappers. It's just that the image itself was tied to whiteness and wealth. What about the new Negro? Now, this is a little bit different from the flapper in the sense that this is less of a symbol, less of an icon, and more of a movement. So remember Harding is saying let's return to normalcy, and something that had been abnormal was in the 19 teens, there had been a rise of kind of race-related violence throughout American cities. 1919 in America was called the Red Summer. And this is when American servicemen returned from World War I, and they really still experienced violence at home. There was an outbreak of city, mostly violence, known as Red Summer. That year was a really hot year that affected at least 26 cities in the United States where there were riots, essentially. And of course, Stokely would say, is it a riot? Is it a revolution, right? It depends. So it has to do with white and African-American violence, in part because you have the Great Migration. So immediately following the Civil War until about the 1920s, and well, really, actually, that's not true. You have a first wave till about the 1920s and 30s, and then later you have more. You have Black families being pulled, right? Being pushed and pulled out of the South. They're being pushed out of the South because, as we talked about in the Reconstruction unit, the South is not a safe space for them, right? It's a violent, hateful space. So they begin to seek out opportunities elsewhere. And you have a pull for Black families from the North and the West because you have access to land, you have access to jobs, right? Or you have the promise of these things one way or another. But then if you've got an influx of African-American migrants for the first time in places like Chicago, Minneapolis, Tulsa, Oklahoma, white white residents and citizens begin to become fearful and angry and hateful because they had always thought of these places as white only. And so you have a return, right? You have like a return to kind of aggression and violence in those cities. And in the exact same time frame, you have the Harlem Renaissance, which is truly what creates that jazz age spirit of the 1920s, right? The 1920s flapper, she wore a lot of clothes, she did a lot of things, but one of the things she had access to was nightlife, right? She had access to jazz clubs, she had access to dancing. A lot of that was inspired by or created by African-American artists. And the Harlem Renaissance was the formation of the jazz era, but it was also a place and a movement of literature, art, culture, politics, and self-determination that really sets in motion kind of the concepts of the civil rights movement as we understand it today. So for example, this is a beautiful piece done by the artist Aaron Douglas in the 1920s, who really celebrated African-American history, who really celebrated Black culture, and didn't do so in a way that emphasized the violence, right, of the backstory. It really emphasizes the promise instead. Now, your text calls this section culture war, which I actually find sort of strange, right? Like, I think it's a strange use of the term culture war, because really what is also happening in the 1920s is xenophobia, a rise of hatred of the other. This is from the white perspective, of course. This is a Eurocentric viewpoint that white landowning men and women in America begin to demonstrate violence and political disenfranchisement against immigrants, because there's a wave of new immigrants. There's a wave of non-Western European immigrants, people coming from places like Poland, people coming from places like Ireland or Italy, but also Asian immigrants from Japan and from China are coming to America, just as 30 years later or earlier, you know, people from Denmark or France or Great Britain were coming, but they're coming for this mass consumption is being like this mass consumption that's ready to wear, ready to drive, ready to eat stuff that's coming from factories, right? From American factories. So they need workers, they need people on the assembly line. So they're recruiting immigrants from across the world to come to America. And with more and more immigrants becomes, I don't know, like a less familiarity for some of these white folks who believe that America has been theirs all along, which of course we know it hasn't been. So you have a rise of political disenfranchisement, major acts that are brought against immigrants from Eastern European, Asia, and Mexico. And then you also have just outright violence, right? You have raids on Chinese camps, for example, outside of San Francisco or near the rail line, because you have this increased like hatred, anger that's kind of permeating throughout the 1920s. This is also a rise of fundamentalist Christianity. So sort of like back to basics Christianity and like a fervor for it. And you'll see lots of waves of these over the course of American history. We have growing concerns, right? With more immigrants from places like Ireland and Italy, you have more Catholics. You also have increased Jewish influences in America at the time. So you have a rise of kind of white middle class Protestantism, and that permeates the culture in a couple of ways. The first I like to show you is the Scopes trial. So on March 21st, 1925, a young biology teacher, John T. Scopes, was tried for teaching his students evolutionary theory. So he's teaching them sort of like the theories of evolution as we have learned them in biology. But this was in violation of Tennessee's Butler Act, which was a state law prohibiting really teaching anything that denied, quote, the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. So anything but Adam and Eve, you're not allowed to teach, scientifically including. So this was because it was funded by state income, right? Scopes was he was like in violation of this act. But I love that the American Yacht points to one more thing. So I think we have this idea that like individuals are like doing certain things and they're like right. And then like the rest of the world is wrong. And someone like Scopes is doing this thing and he's kind of like activating against it and like right rules over wrong. But it's never that easy. There's usually a backstory, and here's the backstory. The American Civil Liberties Union actually sought this as a test case, right? They saw that this would be a great opportunity for taking a case all the way to the Supreme Court, rather, to test the constitutionality of this Tennessee law in the first place. That was how Scopes, who at the time was a part-time teacher and coach, actually admitted, right, to teaching evolution, because he knew that this was now becoming a test trial. These test trials, these test cases are part of the American fabric, right? Look at Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Look at Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Look at Rosa Parks, right? These things don't happen because like one individual just sort of like decides. Like we have this story of Rosa Parks, and she's like this little old lady who was just really tired, and this guy was kind of a bully to her on the bus. Rosa Parks was an activist. Rosa Parks was a executive member of the NAACP. She knew what she was doing. She got on that bus on purpose, right? She sat on that bus with that bus driver on purpose. She was actually following in the footsteps of 4 other African-American women who had done something very similar to her, right? Scopes is a great example of this as well, right? Americans are never just like reactionary. They're always part of they're planning these things. They're engaged, right? We're all part of these systems, and we're aware of it or not. This is a little bit of a trigger, right? So this image of the KKK represents the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Now, you know that the Ku Klux Klan was founded in the post-Civil War South, but it becomes more of a national movement in the 1920s, in part because of 2 things. The first is that, remember like that gasoline, electricity, right? Electricity offered things like movies. Movie going becomes enormously huge in American culture. Do you want to know one of the very first movies, full-length feature movies that was shown in a movie theater? Was called The Birth of a Nation. You should look it up. There's 2 versions. See what happens in the 1920s one. It's one of the most like racist and hateful media pieces that was ever portrayed in the movies. And it was one of the first, and it was a phenomenon among white audiences. And it celebrates like the white violent history of America, and it became popularized, right? You also have widely seen KKK rallies, KKK parades. These are not hidden in the shroudness of darkness. There was I think it was 1919, I believe, but it might have been 1920. There was a Ku Klux Klan parade in Denver, for example, and some of the people participating were like major political figures, people who were running for office, running for mayor, running for governor, right? Not just in Denver, but in other places. These men who are participating in KKK rallies, parades, and ceremonies are out of the shadows, right? They're being celebrated. And the KKK was emphasizing 3 things. And you can look to their foundational documents for this, right? This isn't me just sort of spouting this off, but this is what's in their foundational documents. Emphasis on masculinity, right? So the new woman is a threat, right? Masculinity. Whiteness, the new Negro is a threat, right? Immigrants are a threat. And Protestantism, Catholicism is a threat. So immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Latin America are all threats. So you can see that you have opportunities across the board for people in the 1920s, but there are also threats. And the 1920s has a great reputation for being a time that is rich in culture and celebration and fun, but it wasn't like that for everybody, right? So we'll talk later about Prohibition, but one of the resources I give you this week is the Mob Museum, and they have a whole series done on the road to Prohibition, including the organized crime aspect of Prohibition and how these laws were enforced, as well as how Prohibition changed American culture forever. So one thing I want to point out is the 18th Amendment is what was the Prohibition Amendment. So it was the law federally mandating the existence of alcohol in America. And do you know what the Prohibition Act or what the law prohibited? It prohibited the manufacturing, the sale, and the purchasing of alcohol. Do you know what it didn't prohibit? Drinking. So think about that. What does that mean, right? It's not illegal to drink alcohol. It's illegal to make it, it's illegal to sell it, and it's illegal to buy it. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that before we come back to it later. So here's your challenge. Okay, I had to pause briefly because the title was wrong. Here's your challenge this week: the new era, biography and context. You're going to complete all assigned reading, review all media in this week's reading list, including today's lecture. You're going to select one person from the list provided to study. You're going to identify 10 relevant contextual details. So you can use the lecture, you can use the reading material, you can use, you should have 10 things from there as it is. Anything about this period in American history that pertains to this person, right? That pertains to this person's history. And then you're going to identify 10 relevant biographical details about his, her, or their contributions in America at that time. So remember, a person's context is what's happening around them. Well, all of the things I just talked about. Maybe you're going to study an African-American poet. You probably want to focus on the new Negro. You probably want to focus on the racial violence in some of the cities, right? But maybe a flapper could give you some information too. If you're focusing on a woman, maybe what is the flapper culture like for her? So relevant contextual details about this person's life and 10 biographical details about them. So stories about me are not the same thing as stories about my context. And then you're going to fill out, there's a handout for you. You're going to fill out the handout, but then you're going to write one sentence about any aspect in this person's life or history that blends context with history. Okay? There should be a link to the library database I'd like you to use and a list of potential people to research. Good luck, historians. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.